All right, welcome everybody. This is our third kind of like discussion group, where we read stuff and then chat about it. So I guess I usually have ways of starting things off. I make notes for sort of like what generally the conversation is going to be. But it's just a guide. It's just something to sort of, as I'm reading the stuff and then thinking about our work and your work and my work, I tend to just sort of think about kind of activities and stuff we could do. So in the chat, I'll put just sort of the prep notes for the class. But does anyone want to start off with any thoughts on, we're kind of concluding this chunk of reading. So we're going to retire this text, which, we've read 5 chapters of, and then we'll move into something else, which will be kind of an overview of 3 different language programs, or sort of a perspective. And that's what we'll do next week. So any immediate thoughts, reactions to the reading?
I thought the teaching practices one was a little bit, I kept getting lost in the woods or in the weeds. It was like the test and then the testing of the test and the test. I was like, how many times did they say test in this paragraph? And then I'd lose my spot. So that one I kind of got a little bit lost in, where I kept having to reread sections because I was like, did I just read this? So
Yeah. I don't know. I'd probably hit my threshold with this particular, just the way that he's doing stuff. I felt like kind of was saying the same thing by that point. And so I was like, okay, maybe we should have stopped 2 chapters ago. I do think it's good to sort of set some of the tone and do some stuff. But yeah, I do like some of the things of like tying it to community and to relevance, but it was sort of getting irrelevant at some point. And any other thoughts?
You're speaking of chapters 5 and 6, Hongwa?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, one moment. I'm just scrolling to the place. That's my cat. I know.
the cat had a lot to say about these chapters.
Yeah, he does.
Teach you about language.
He's saying,
Okay. The section, well, there's a piece in the identification of target community and social practices that really resonated with me. And it's in the last paragraph, just above, describe aims and objectives. The sentence reads, the intertextuality or composite nature of text means that instruction in one context has generalizable, transferable resources across domains and sectors of human activity. That really resonated with me because being in, this is like my 2nd class with you, Ane, and it reminded me of the different resources that you've openly shared on the screen, and had mentioned that it's open for any student in these target languages to use for either Hadkil or Shmelgil. Yeah, I really liked that part in reading these different practices.
Yeah, and so everything is a text. That's one thing that we can also take from this. Like the word text it just mean it's something. It could be a speech, it could be an elder who comes to visit, and we're not trying to disrespect someone by calling them a text. We're just saying like that word means this is something we can utilize. And so sometimes we're going to be producing things and encouraging folks to produce things. And then sometimes we're also going to be sort of pulling things in and examining them. And this could be a recording that's 100 years old, and maybe you're listening to it and you're going to interact with it. And so, yeah, like, and trying to think of, I've got a set of questions that I'm going to ask you folks. But anyone else? Any other thoughts?
Like a lot of the characteristics of the social practices are things that you implement in your Tlingit classes. And I had always taken them for granted until I read them. And it was kind of funny seeing a name for them, like building a sense of community. And I kept on being like, oh yeah, we do that. Oh yeah, we do that. We have membership. We have participation in the membership. We work on things together. We make things together. And so it was kind of cool looking at it, like breaking down the fourth wall and like seeing some of the things that I think you probably crafted for your classes that just seemed like they happened naturally. So that was cool.
Okay. I like it. We go from cats to birds. It's really a nice transition. And I think the cat is like, I'm a deuce, not a douche. So, just a few more animal jokes. Yeah, but like tone setting, and these are really important in terms of, and there's some hard lessons as well. Like sometimes you'll have a group of folks who, if you're teaching adults, and then sometimes the language has its own way of dealing with humor. And sometimes folks will start taking it farther and farther and farther, and they'll get really suggestive, and other stuff will go on. And then maybe an elder is going to chime in, it's happened to me. And someone said, this doesn't sound very respectful. And so that was the tune, that was, the tone shift. And so it's always a negotiation too. And when you're dealing with language revitalization, it's really interesting because everybody has to be a part of the thing. And it's really a challenge to create an environment that does, because we're not picking our friends and our social groups and other things. That certainly is a part of it. But as sort of a leader in a language movement, you're going to have certain, we call them cliques or groups or gangs, whatever we want to call them. And then part of your job is going to be sort of nudging those groups together, but also sometimes fostering those groups, because if they're using the language among their groups, then that's great. But then, there's always group dynamics. I was on the search board of directors for a while. And somebody said to me, why do you go to lunch with those guys? We don't like those guys. And I said, well, because I'm not in high school, and we can all be friends. I can be friends with you, I can be friends with them. And if you guys aren't all friends, that doesn't really affect me. And so, I mean, as long as nobody's like really being mean to each other, if there's not a lot of, sometimes that drama is manufactured, but sometimes that you can't totally dismiss it, and sort of dealing with it is something that you'll be working on your whole life if this is the route you go. Speaking of production, so in the chat, there's a link to a Google folder for some Valentine's Day cards. So I just kind of had fun with this thing, and the template's there if you folks want to use it and share it. So I had ones that didn't have translations, and these ones have translations. So there's a little fox that says, "Ach inchke ekuchsati," will you be with me? And a little, I guess it's a hedgehog. I'll call it a porcupine. "Chusachan i'inyin qati," may love be with you. And then a little polar bear says, "Yisikuush wasa echsachan," if you only knew how I love you. And then wuchin chanachsati, let's be together. But in the interest of fairness, I created some anti-Valentine's ones. And what was fun was like, I did it on Facebook. I put them up and I said, here's a link to the PDF if you want to print them, cut them, make little cards. And then on Twitter, I put them up, but I didn't say which one was which. Just so, and some people are sharing the anti-Valentine's one, which is kind of fun. And not to be mean in our language, and it's always a delicate thing because you could talk stuff into being, but you know, some people can act a fool in relationships, and sometimes love and hate isn't that far apart. So this one says, I don't need you, and you broke my heart. And when I see you, I'm going to attack you, and I don't care about you. So they're kind of funny, but also it's speaking from a cultural perspective as well. Like respect and kindness, these things are always there, but you gotta be able to have fun sometimes. So, if you want to translate those, and they could say other things, whatever works for you folks in your languages. But the bottom line, I think it's good to just put the language out there. And it's a negotiation because I understand. There's an elder I worked with a lot, and I still work with him when I can go to Canada. And he's super old school in terms of way of thinking. Like if there's some thing, like I was looking at these translation activities called storyboards. And one of them is about these people who go hunting bears. I'm like, I ain't using that ever. Because, he just kept saying like he wouldn't do any activity with there's a bear in there, even if it was just fun. Because he's an inland Tlingit person, and they just kind of believe you're not supposed to even talk about them. And so like that level of respect was really neat to see. But sometimes we were trying to, because when I was learning Hawaiian, one time a teacher said, when someone says poheo oi, which is was it wasaiiti or sinudang haidang, and smelga, how do you say how are you? Can someone tell me?
Ndakwalan.
Yes.
How's your name doing?
Oh, thank you. Thank you for explaining that as well. So when you say how are you doing in Hawaiian, what we were told is the answer is maikai, good. Like that's the answer. They're not really asking how you're doing, they're just saying hello. And I don't know if that's the case with every single person, but that was sort of a thing that they taught. And sometimes that's a cultural thing, like in English as well. Uh, sometimes in the pandemic and everything else that's going on, I've been trying to shift to what's new or like what I don't even know how to start conversations because like if you really know someone, sometimes you're really asking how you doing, but sometimes you're just saying hey, so how's it going is hey. So in Tlingit, I was kind of worried that the only things we knew how to say is good. I was like, well, what if you want to say something else? Like there were plenty of elders who would give me these sort of none of your business type things or these funny type of things, like I'm just me, or literally that's like like it's not your business, and they'd usually laugh. But then also like what if you're doing bad? What if what if things are terrible? Because I went through this series on life not too long ago, and people are like, how are you? I'm like, I'm terrible. Like life sucks. And but that's not for everybody. One time I ordered a sandwich at a place, and I was like, how's it going? And then he started telling me like how his day was going, and I just sort of like blurted out my sandwich order, and then I felt bad. Then I felt mad, and then I felt awkward, and I should have just ran away, but I stayed. I was like, just sandwich, please. So, but long story long, I was trying to figure out like what are the things we want to teach people how to say I'm sad and I'm in pain and these other things. Because I saw this one conversation with the elders, and she was like, how are you doing? She's like, oh, my back hurts, my knee hurt, and I was like, that was legit. And so but he didn't want to do it. He was getting kind of upset because he said, if you talk about these things, they're gonna happen. And I said, well, I want to respect that, but we need to teach people how to say stuff or else they'll switch to English. So there's my long ramble for the day. Out to gone. See, your hand is up.
Um, because we're on the topic of Valentine's Day and stuff, I have this old printout that I actually got from Kushia in 2016, but it says it's at the top that it was made in 2011. It also has some anti Valentine's Day stuff on it, and before I offered to, you guys can have it, but if you already had it, then maybe I can show you and you guys can decide if you want it, or like it's like a long like list of phrases. It's like a little packet. It's got some like funny stuff on it too. like don't kiss me. And like I don't secret lover. It just has some funny stuff on there.
Yeah, I do think that one's still out there. And so I think there's a couple versions you could find, probably one through Goblin Heritage Foundation. I think the Sea Alaska one has kind of a broken link. And then I think it's at the Alaska Native Knowledge Network. I think that particular one is. So yeah, it's fun. Like it doesn't always have to be the nice stuff, but yeah.
Okay. I just figured I would check. I think it's funny. If any of you guys wanted it, I can just scan it in and email it or whatever.
Great. And so I shared a curriculum folder with you folks, and those of you in the Huttkill cohort, check out learninghaida.com. And as that sort of, it's totally just in the starting phases, but the goal is to have something similar to clinkitlanguage.com. I'd be happy to do this with Samalgich as well, if that's what the learning community wants to do. Like the framework behind what I've been able to construct with Clinkit is there's a blog, which is a WordPress blog that really points to two different things. One is things in Google folders, and then the second is things on YouTube. So recording classes and elders and putting that up on YouTube, and then taking recordings and printed materials and everything else and sort of putting that into a Google folder. So there's a single Haida curriculum Google folder that we're building. These are teachers in Heidelberg and Ketchikan and Masset and Skidegate, and we're trying to sort of collaborate and figure out how to sort of get kind of a one-stop shop for all the resources. And again, like I'd love to do it with, if that's what the Samalgich community wants to do, let's figure it out, because it's great to just sort of have everything in one spot. Because one of the big things with curriculum design is, what do you do when you don't even know what you have and you don't know what's needed and you have to do it all and you only have a few people? Like it's just sort of, it's easy for it to just compound, and it feels like you're trying to, there's these, the Chilkat River is a very big river, and it's silty, it's super wide, and it's also a little bit unpredictable. It just channels sort of wind around these little islands and stuff. And the village of Klukwan has always been there, and it used to be a really large village. Now it's pretty small. But there are these folks doing ecotourism, going by these rafts, and there's always a bit of tension because they would go by and pick up people's nets to show the tourists like the salmon, and like that's gonna start a fight, and so you don't go mess around with people's food and their stuff. Like it's just really rude. And anyways, there was a group of folks who were these sort of tour leaders who were out in the Chilkat River with a shovel, and they had shovels, and so these guys come over in their boat, like, what are you guys doing? They said, well, the river used to go through here, and so now it moved over here, so we're going to try and move it back here. And there was no chance. There's just no chance that they were going to do this. Like two guys with a shovel. It's a big, huge river. And so sometimes I think that's what it feels like when you're trying to do all this stuff with language shift, is you're trying to do this impossible task, and he's got this little shovel. So thoughts? Anybody got any thoughts?
I think the Shmai community would love to have one place with all our resources. We do use two orthographies, like Shugaina, Doname, Assay Down, Medik. They use the Alaskan. And then over in BC, they use the Dun orthography. So working under Ashley Dow and Medique, I was always told just to use the Alaskan. But I don't think either way is correct or wrong. But there are some people that they're just very specific on which orthography they use. When I taught the Juno Shmalia group, I just used both. And in my final project, I used both for my thesis. So I think both is the safest way to go.
Yes, I write for
Yeah.
Molly of Denali, and I've been trying to pitch this episode called Dialect Wars, and then like Orthography Wars would be another one, but they just laugh at me and like, no way. But yeah,
Yeah. First to
orthography.
publish would be first one wrong in that one, in that battle. Unless you include both, then yeah, it's just a race to wrong if you don't balance that one correctly, for sure.
Exactly. I mean, maybe there's a future where they can align, but it's sort of like you gotta work with what works. And so a movement like this wouldn't seek to force standardization upon the communities. Like that should always be the sovereign decision of the language communities. And so with Tlingit, we had that for quite a while, and there's still some holdovers and still some bad blood and like some nasty letters have been written. And so yeah, like if it's gonna fragment stuff, then just deal with two. Just deal with, and and with dialects, you always have to respect the dialect. So the difference being a dialect is sort of like there's enough of a difference here that you can clearly identify what the difference is, right? So you could say, okay, over here they make this sound, and over here they make that sound. And when you're over there, you make that sound. When you're over here, you make this sound. When it comes to orthography, that's the way that you write the language. And so how do you deal with this character? And how do you deal with this? And how do you deal with this kind of sound? And is this thing one word or two word? And when does it become one word? And so all of that is what we call standardization, and sort of like it can get a little bit more technical than that, because sometimes standardizing is also dealing with the language is shifting and this is how we're doing this thing. And then sometimes it deals with how you're writing it. Oh, okay. Yeah, and it's really usually, and then when we've tried to deal with these situations too, we try not to say one's better, but we just try to come from the place of we can't afford to, and I'm not trying to make that argument for anybody, but just in terms of the ways that we've been trying to deal with it for Tlingit, because with Tlingit it was also, you had one way of writing in the United States and you had one way of writing in Canada, and then we were coastal people and those are inland people. So you already had these sort of natural, or kind of unnatural, I would think, divisions. One of them is a natural division. The culture is just different for inland Tlingit people because they're not on the ocean. In the language, that makes a big difference, and with the culture, it makes a big difference. But then once you add the sort of United States-Canada thing, it sort of becomes this enhanced sense of identity where it's like, oh yeah, we're from here, this is how we write, they're from there, this is how they write. But it got to the point where no active teachers were teaching in a community, and they were saying they didn't want anyone else to come in and teach because they were going to write the language differently. And that was when it was getting a little strange, because it was sort of like, we'll rather have it die than deal with sort of compromising on how to write it. And I was really trying to argue, it's like, we're talking about like this system developed by a white person, and then this other system developed by a white person. We're not even talking about our stuff. And so, but they are real, they are emotional, they're connected to identity, whether we like it or not. And they're also connected to this sort of building up teams and having a sense of solidarity. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Dr. Michael D'Angeli, she's a good middle ground for us. And we get a chance to work with her in our speaking practice. Like today in Canada, they say like with the S, supush for like new, and I use the SH, the shoe push, because my teachers are from Alaska, and I'm like, am I saying it wrong? And she said, no, that's the way I was taught to say it. So somebody that is willing to let us be individuals is a good middle ground. So it's always good to have Dr. Michaela.
Okay, any other thoughts on that? So let me ask you folks, can you think of something?
This is Lyanna.
Oh, go ahead.
I don't see anybody moving, so maybe my internet is not working, so I can't answer.
Oh, okay. I can hear you now.
Michelle?
Okay, well, we can hear you. I wasn't sure if you were chiming in to say something, or if you were just letting me know you were here.
Oh, okay. Well, no, if you can hear me, you're asking, sometimes we may cross the border for some reason, whatever that might be. And I do like having that guidelines and the practices that the Maui have. And, knowing when you can say things and when you absolutely can't is not like knowing, like when we're writing and we know the root, and then we can add prefixes and suffixes. We have an idea of what we can add and what we shouldn't, and what we should stay away from. And so as I'm listening to you talk, it was just a big, huge thing, and it's not an easy thing to answer. So it's a good question, though. I like it.
All right. Sheesh. So just sort of thinking about some of the things we're reading in these latest chapters. Can you folks think of something where there's a literal translation, but that is different than the meaning? So like if you just sort of looked at those words and then you sort of said, okay, that's what these words mean. But when you actually put those together in a certain order, it has a totally different meaning. I can give you an example. So here, unless someone else, anybody got an example?
Is that like
Think of anything?
blue or something like that? Or sigu? I don't know. Like I feel like sometimes it means like happy or good or doing or something like that. Like when you're asking like how someone's doing versus, I don't know, I might have something a little backward.
Okay. No, well, there is sort of a similar thing as well, where like you might have a single word in an indigenous language that takes a whole paragraph to sort of translate, right? But it could, like, what I was thinking of, for example, there's this phrase in Tlingit that's "Cha'akaya yegachtusane," where it literally means cha is just, akaya is to resemble something, ye to resemble it literally means resemble it, and then yegachtusane means we're going to do it or fix it. So when you add them together, it means we're just going to do it looking like it. And so you'd get a little lost, but if you know culturally what the meaning is, it's we're just going to imitate our ancestors. And it's one of those things where it's like it's impossible to separate. And so what I'm trying to get at here is there's a cultural meaning sometimes to a set of words that goes above and beyond sort of the individual word meaning.
I had something I was thinking of in the story here. I can't quite find it off the top of my head, but when she's walking into the woods with the bear, David was trying to have us kind of pick apart the sentence, and at first it just seemed like all of a sudden it was in her face. Her nose was in her face, but if you looked at the sentence a little differently, it was She was stepping over logs, but they were actually mountains. And all of a sudden, where they were going, it was like she fell on it, on her face. So it's like she crossed this whole part of the forest in just a few steps. Whereas if you just looked at it in English, she was just walking across some logs and fell, kind of seemed. But I can't find the sentence in Tlingit, so that kind of takes away from it.
Yeah, yeah. And so like this, it could have to do with metaphor. Like sometimes metaphor is going to be presented, or there's a whole bunch of stuff in the language too, where it's sort of like kind of a similar realm might be. There's been things that I've heard in the language and talked to other people about in the language, but as soon as I translate it for somebody, it seems like it's unbelievable. But when I'm in the language, I'm like, oh yeah, that's fact, that's true, that happened, that's the way it was. And so that's another sort of interesting component. Yeah, that's a good example. I'll look for that one so we could look at it in class sometime. Anyone else?
Itinakhatyati seems like it has a different literal translation from just I need.
Yeah, yeah. So when you say itinakhatiti, you're saying I need something, right? Whatever the first thing you name is. But it literally means I am through the remains of it, right? And so it's really interesting to think about this stuff. And so one of the things that the author continues to talk about in this text is creating meaning and leading students to meaning with the use of a text. And for me, it's always interesting because you want folks to connect, right? So you want them to connect to meanings that they're able to interpret stuff and they're able to say stuff. But you also want them to do so in a way that they're increasing their own cultural fluency as well, if it's not high. Like it could be high. There could be somebody, whether they're ethnically from the indigenous group or not, they could have grown up, they know all kinds of stuff about how the culture works, but they don't know the language. And so when they start learning the language, they're applying it to certain areas. And that could be jarring in some ways because it could sort of challenge someone who says, I know a lot about the culture. How? And then when they go into the language, it could be really frustrating that they don't know how the language works. But in another case, you could have someone who's not from the culture and has also not been around it, and so they don't understand how the culture works, and they can use the language, but they end up maybe offending people or saying stuff kind of pretty like incorrectly in terms of just from a cultural perspective. And so it's always an interesting thing for me to think about, like and so I start framing it in these contexts of things that mean something differently, because there's a whole bunch of them in every language, and same with English, right? Like if somebody came here and they're learning English and someone said, well, they kicked the bucket, like, which people don't say a whole lot anymore, but then they'd be like, what happened? And there's a bunch of other stuff that's sort of like that, and there's sort of these phrases that have this deeply embedded meaning in them. So I guess similar, can you think of something that does not translate well, either from English to an indigenous language or from an indigenous language to English?
There's a word called whoosh dukaha. When you literally take it apart, it becomes something about coming together, possessive. And then just looking at the parts in the dictionary, it just doesn't go with the full meaning. And of course, the meaning is in the story.
Yeah, sheesh. Other examples, other thoughts?
Kind of like there's variants word has a different tone on it too. Like yay can mean raven or to lie, depending on the tone. And that can be confusing for me as a learner.
Yeah, yeah.
What about hesh ikau decay? Like you didn't unravel yourself?
Yeah, you didn't fall apart. And that's how you say you did a good job. So that's kind of a, I always like that. I was like, gee, that sounds kind of like us. It's like, hey, great job not failing. All right. Because yeah, the positive form is I totally failed. I like really came undone. But then it's related to this, there's other related verbs that come off of that root, which is like if you say a kausake, that could be tracking an animal. It could be undoing, weaving, undoing, uh, to rip your beading out or your sewing out. And it could also be to untangle something. So, and then when you have, because then you could say chetkau decay, like I just failed. But it's really sort of pointing to like I fell apart. And so teshikau decay is, hey, you didn't fail. Good job.
Doesn't when you say I'm sad, it translates to like my heart is sick or
Yeah,
something?
yeah. So that, I mean, that's another interesting one. So this phrase like tu wu. It's like as you start to teach folks a language, right? It's really interesting to me to think about when do you begin to introduce a whole bunch of these concepts, because they're going to start seeing the word tu wu all over the place. And then really it means thoughts, intentions, spirits, feelings, emotions, desires. And it's highly contextual because you could say, Ach tuwu sagu, I'm happy. Ach tuwu yanik. So the first one, I'm happy, literally means my spirit happy. Ach tuwu yanik, my spirit sick, and that's saying sad. But I could say wasa ituwuch, and that's saying what do you think or what do you want. So it's really an interesting term, and every language is going to have these set of terms, or it's sort of like it's going to take a whole paragraph to explain what this thing means. I'll tell you other things that tend to not work well, and people are going to come. They're going to come ask you to translate this stuff, like these single word kind of mission statement types of things. Like, can you translate integrity? And they'll have like all these single words that are sort of that work well in English, right? You can have like these 4 words, and that really defines what the organization is. But when you go to an indigenous language, it doesn't always work.
How did that one phrase go, by the way? Like when you taught us I'm drunk and it was like under the horse's tail, like Gaudon some I don't
Gaudan tlidi taiyeti. Yeah, they are under the horse's tail. So yes,
one of my favorites.
so sometimes you're gonna get to these things that are just sort of these. Oh, there's a term for them. I'm forgetting it now. They're parables, right? So parables, and then there's other sorts of things. An idiom, yeah, where it's sort of like that's a particular saying, and so sometimes you're gonna get to like you're gonna say these things in this particular way, in this particular order. So how about this, folks? I have a colleague, yes, and a riddle. Sometimes it's asked as a question, but it's not seeking an answer necessarily, but sometimes it is. Like if you watch these really old speakers, like sometimes they'll ask a question and someone will yell out the answer, and that was like just something that they did. Uh, Anybody know what Chamorro is? Somebody tell me what Chamorro is.
A person from Guam, Angwa.
Yes. Yeah, so it's a person from Guam.
Beautiful people.
Yeah, yeah. One of my colleagues, when I was getting in my PhD program, he was from Guam. We just had so much fun. He really liked to laugh, and he was working in their Chamorro language program. And and one of the things he had all these funny. One of the funny things he really did in class a lot. He'd say things like, "Well, with Chamorro, we have an old saying. It's give peace a chance." So he'd just quote like some pop music or something. It was just hilarious. And he's a really funny guy, but he was a really good scholar as well. And one time he said, we're having this sort of discussion because if you teach your language, you are probably going to teach an artificial form of that language. And then you're going to naturalize people. But that's a process that's jarring for a lot of people. And if there have not been very many folks who have learned the language, it's also, as they learn, it's going to sound stilted and jarring and strange, and people are going to be critical, and they're going to probably call it college Tlingit or college Haida or college Tsimshian. And so one of the things, as we were having a discussion about this, he said, I speak my grandmother's language, but I don't speak like my grandmother. What do you folks think about that?
Definitely, I remember hearing Klishk and everybody that was there around her house all the time, and just the way they spoke was, hear that, and that was just in her house, like whether it be before a kuik or just her friends just showed up and they were all talking, and it was just all Tlingit, and I never wanted to say anything because I was like, I don't want to ruin this with English. I just want to hear what they're saying. But the way they speak is just so, it just, I don't know, it's complex and beautiful. I mean,
Other thoughts? Yeah, what? So often we're trying to replicate the old masters. Like that's what a lot of us are trying to do. And it's interesting because as you're getting there, you have to do a whole bunch of stuff, and you have to learn patterns that aren't really natural, right? Like if you're speaking and someone says, hey, where are you going? I might say, to the store, right? But if you're learning a language, they'll say, where are you going? I am going to the store, right? So you do these a lot more complete sentence type of stuff, and then you end up pulling it back. And then every language class usually has these dialogue things that you practice. But then it's interesting because you could make the argument, it sounds like robots talking. And so just in terms of, and this for me, this is related to cultural fluency, because then you also have linguistic fluency, right? So you're just your fluency in the language, your ability to sort of do the things you need to do in order to speak the language, but then to also naturalize it so that one, and that has a lot of meanings. One, it's easier for someone to just speak and listen, right? It's a lot less sort of assembly and translation and all this other work where you're just sort of free flowing, just kind of interacting with the language. But then two, it's also just sort of becoming so familiar with it as well that you're able to sort of talk. And this is where it also gets really interesting for me. You want to talk about, you want to be able to talk about all the old stuff, all the important stuff, the cultural material, the ceremonies, the clans, the identity, the land, the animals. But you also want to be able to talk about everything else, right? It's got to become a medium for everything and not just this thing that's frozen in time. But that doesn't mean you can just do anything you want any way you want. And so these are negotiations that happen with every single language, and every single language in the world changes with every generation, even between generations. And so these are things that 20 years from now, we'll probably be looking at the 15-year-olds who are talking, and we'll be um, shaking our fists at it and thinking that everything's, in great decline. And that happens with every language. With indigenous languages, it becomes perhaps even more intense because the reality of losing a lot of cultural information is very real.
I think is it's awesome that on Zoom we can all still be like together, but there's a big part of it that's like even in schools, they try to teach. I've been in classes where they try to get kids to speak up when someone's at least addressing the class, like, you know, you're mentioning your father's people and your grandfather's people, or people who are there, or just like in these old other speeches, you know, someone's talking and they're like, your father's people are with you, or we hear you, you know, things like that aren't, I don't see in classes. And it's hard right now, because then we can't cut everybody off, and then if we all do, it's like we can't hear. Maybe it gets too distorted with Zoom, you know, to chime in just to say "gunchish" or you know, we hear you, or anything like that you would hear at a kuik long ago, or even just when people are talking.
Yeah, I mean, so part of Tlingit culture is when someone from your clan opposite, so if you're a raven or a crow, they're an eagle or a wolf, when they're talking, like if, and it's interesting because not for everybody, it's not for everybody to do, but you could yell stuff at them like fairly loud. And what you're yelling is like, I hear you. That's how it is. That's correct. We're listening to you. Like those are the things that you sort of um, that you kind of yell at people. Thank you, right? And it's really interesting because it's a cultural thing. Like, what do you do when people are talking? And you could see this with different religions, and especially like whether we're talking about what particular culture this is and what part of the country it's in. Like some people, they just really yell out amen or, you know, hallelujah and stuff. And in other, you if you went from one church to another church and they were given the sermon and you like jumped up and yelled something, like people might get kind of freaked out. And same with you know, like so sometimes if you go to the potlatch, it's very long. It's very, very long. And so there was a story that was circulating around. I'm sure it's gone around different places. And there was an older guy, and sometimes at a potlatch he'd fall asleep, take a little nap, and then when people would call his name or acknowledge his clan, someone would nudge him, and he'd say, "Oh, what?" You know, which is just sort of like acknowledging that someone's talking to you. But I guess one day he was in church and kind of nodded off, and his wife was next to him and gave him the elbow, and he went, "Oh, what?" Yeah, so yeah, but it's all about the culture and the context, right? Because in another context, I was living in Heidelberg, and I was living in Kasan, sorry, and I was learning Haida with Julie Coburn, and we had someone who was not from the community, who was not Haida, who was coming to do some work with us, and when he wrote me an email, he like looked up the Haida word for brother, and he used that as a greeting, and I wrote back and I said, hey, you're not there yet, you know, like there's a whole kinship structure that you don't understand, you know. And so for me, he was jumping in too hot, you know. And so and but also too uh, kind of all over the place today, but it's fine. Like so if your agreement yeah, like if your agreement is we're learning the language, and so one of the keys is if you're learning the language and I'm learning the language, whenever we see each other, we speak in the language, right? Like you're going to have these cultural agreements that you're going to have to foster in your language communities. Because at some point, you're going to have to decide English is fine, other folks can speak it, it's not endangered. Our language is going to die if we don't speak it to each other. But that requires social adaptation, because what if other people there don't understand the language, right? And so these are things I've had to work on with my kids, because sometimes they would get kind of embarrassed if I would speak to them, and like I could see it, and I would talk to them and I would say, it doesn't matter, it doesn't matter if they don't understand, this is what we do. And they got comfortable with it. But same with there's a bunch of other things too, like what if an older relative is there and it breaks their heart, because they might say, you know, I never got a chance to learn. And then you know, and you're going to have these decisions to make about keeping everybody comfortable and making some of the hard choices, which is it's a negotiation, and part of it is carving out that time, carving out that space, which was one of the big things they did in Hawaii. Was they sort of made this was a kind of an unwritten agreement. And I said, hey, what happens to people who don't switch and speak Haida with you or speak Hawaiian with you guys? And they said, oh, they just leave. And we don't tell them to leave, but they just get uncomfortable eventually and leave. And so the ones who, and so you're going to have to construct this whole other world, which is really fascinating. And I'll tell you folks one other thing, and then we'll move on to something else. We had a gathering, and one of the things that they tasked me with was to keep everybody in the language. It was a pretty large gathering. It was public. It was being recorded. It was being broadcasted. And so when people would switch to English, I would go to the microphone and tell them that they had to speak in Tlingit. This was very hard because maybe somebody is giving their emotional story in English about why they can't speak the language, and that's important. But it was the wrong venue, and so I was trying to say, like, this is probably the last big gathering of speakers we're going to have. We don't have the time to stay in English, and we said this multiple times, set it up, and I kept shooting people down, shooting them, and say, if you're going to switch to English, we're going to give you a warning, then we're going to come get the microphone. And that's hard to do. And so here's what somebody said to me. They walked up to me and they said, you know what you're doing to us is the same thing that people did to us in boarding schools. And I said, well, I don't agree with that. I understand it could be hard, but if nobody does this, then it does not happen. And so you have to get yourself ready for those situations. And you also, but I think if you do it enough, you have to naturalize these new behaviors. They have to become new behaviors. If the language is not vibrant, then somebody's got to be the marshal. Somebody's got to be the sergeant at arms, and it's a challenge.
There is really a lot of old pain there. And sometimes when we don't talk about it, it comes up. I know when I first started Tlingit classes, my chest hurt. My throat just was in a grip because I grew up with my parents' stories and it wasn't good. But I think a class or some kind of ceremony needs to be done so that a student can come out of it and say, no matter what, we're going to go for it. And, we have to have our own reasons for it. But, from time to time, you will run into people and those subjects will hurt really deep. And so, yeah, what can you say? It would have been nice if there was something said at the beginning, but, it's kind of strange when you're talking in public. How can you go through a whole healing ceremony right there before you start to talk? So it's all very good discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, Chish. So one of the ideas that I got from Wayne Price. So Wayne was going around doing these healing totem poles and healing dugout canoes. And so like healing and sobriety was a big part of what he was doing. And I talked to him quite a bit about, the intention behind it and the ideas, because healing's, it's got to be a lot more than, our own version of get over it, like, what was that joke going around on like Facebook or something? It was like, don't look at the baby, he'll cry, when the baby falls down or something. But at the same time, like with our own people, when we talk about the levels of healing that are required to reconnect the people in their language, it's monumental. And so one of the things that I try to do in language classes and gatherings is, so Wayne would take a whole bunch of wood chips, you say, everybody write down a name of somebody you lost because of addiction. And so people would write their names down, that have a talking circle, and they would, that's the other thing is, can we create an environment where we're not always out of time and money? And I think that takes a conscious push back against the clock and against the sort of the powers that be that are always dangling the purse strings, And then at the end they burned it. And they also did a lot of ceremonies and talking about the things that we do. And these will have to be the ceremonies. Part of them are going to be the actual ceremonies that you and your people do. The other part of it is going to be recreating some ceremonies that your people don't do anymore. Because there will always be people who tell you you're doing it wrong. And this doesn't mean you just do whatever you want, but you study the language, you study the culture, and you bring stuff back. And you say, we're reconstructing this the best way we know how and the best way we can. So I have folks take out little pieces of paper and say, take as many as you need. And I want you to write down on that piece of paper every reason you could think of why you can't, why you won't speak this language. And write down everything. Like I am worried I might make a mistake, or I feel bad because someone told me this was evil, or I don't think, whatever the thing could be. And I try not to list too many examples, but I try to just make sure they know, like anything, nobody will ever read what you write down. But what you are doing by writing it down is you are preparing to let go of that thing. The negativity and the self-doubt, and also the group hatred and self-hatred, and the desires to sometimes hurt each other or cut each other down or keep things from each other, like those are things we're going to have to overcome. And so then we do, when we talk about a little bit, if anybody wants to share anything, then we sort of talk about it. And then we have a fire, we burn it. And ideally, like, however your peoples do things, but we usually will have a meal, take a little bit of everything from the meal, take a little bit of tobacco, and name off some ancestors that we want to feed, and we put that in the fire, and then we put those fears in the fire, and we say, we're giving it to the ancestors, because we ain't strong enough to carry it, and we don't want to carry it anymore. And I think things like that do help. And so you will, I think, encounter trouble if you just sort of just power through, but instead be intentional about the healing part of the process. And these are things that every community, I think, will figure out, and every group will figure out. Okay, so looking forward and thinking about, this is all stuff that I think you could put into your philosophy of education. So whatever your language is, I want you to create a philosophy of education for your language. And all this stuff can be totally just, it's best if it's just written down and it's part of the way you operate. Because we started figuring out, how do we make the cultural values that our elders talked about and still talk about? And how do we make sure that's part of what we do and we don't just replicate other education systems that are out there? So some of the things that I think, let's see, what am I looking for? That I think should be part of what you're doing is, let me zoom in here. So like building a program, your program is going to have a culture, right? So there's a culture of the program, and it's going to be kind of up to you and the other teachers and administrators and leaders to determine what that culture is going to be, and you should be purposeful about that. That way it's already determined. So someone can't come in here and just do whatever they want, because there's, and I think of the Hawaiian programs, and they've got all kinds of stuff that's distinctively Hawaiian. You take your shoes off or your slippers, whatever you're wearing, before you go into the classroom. You ask the teacher permission for, there's a whole bunch of things that go into that. So there's an ideology, which is sort of like, how does this program, what are the predetermined methods of thinking and believing? And that's, again, that's an ongoing discussion. If you go into the Hawaiian medium schools, you'll hear this word Yesu all the time. Yesu, Yesu. And that's Hawaiian for Jesus. And so they sing hymnals, and they have prayers, and they do all kinds of stuff, and it's a public school, and they're absolutely fine with it. But that's going to be up to your school to determine. How do you start the day? What do you do? For them, they blow through this conch shell, then they all gather, and then they line up all the students from males on one side, females on the other, oldest to youngest. All the teachers, they're lined up, males on one side, females on the other. They're lined up in terms of their linguistic genealogy. So the one who first learned Hawaiian as a second language and has been using it the longest, it's right there. Then the next one, and they know who they are. And that's their seniority, that's their order. And then they sing this chant that Larry Kimura made. And then maybe next week we'll start class with just listening to what their day sounds like. I'll probably do it without the recording because I don't have permission to share it publicly. But it's called the Pico Ceremony. And then they have a very specific thing. So one of the male teachers will step forward and talk to the kids. And then one of the female teachers will step forward and then talk to the kids. And they told me this models a Hawaiian family. So in a Hawaiian family, usually everybody would get together and they would eat and they would get ready to start their day long time ago. And then the father would say, okay, here's what we're going to do today. This is what we're doing. And then when he was done, then the mother would chime in and reaffirm that and also correct a lot of behavior. So she'd say, okay, your father said we're going to go out and we're going to clear these, kalo plants out and we're going to harvest them. But yesterday you were playing all day and you're not going to play today. And that's the type of thing that they would do to start their day. So like you have to map all this stuff out and you have to construct the culture and build this world for your ideal school. And don't think about what you think you can do, but think about what should be done. Pedagogy, how do you teach? And there's a lot that goes into this. Like, what are the subjects? What are the materials? And so this course is called Methods and Materials. So this is more of the methods, and the materials is just making language stuff. Valentine Day cards and science books, history books, whatever. The ancestry, right? The place should have a heritage. If it's a Haida school, they better know who Irma Lawrence is. If it's a Tlingit school, they better know who Nora Dowenhower is, right? And so there's also going to be this thing, like you go into I got lots of pictures of the Hawaiian language school, and I think we're going to try and do a virtual tour. I'm going to let you folks know if I can get it set up. It'll be in March. And if you go through there, like it's a Hawaiian school. They got all kinds of pictures of ancestors all over the place. And then the discourse, like how does it work? How does the tone work? This one teacher, he's one of my role models. We're sitting in this gym and they're like kids were just going crazy. It was gym time. Yelling, playing back, and everything's in the language, it's still in Hawaiian. We're just being wild, like they're supposed to be. And super loud because the gym, you know how a gym gets when you pack it full of kids that are doing all kinds of different stuff. And it was kind of free gym time, right? So they were just running around. And he looked at us, he said, watch this, I'll say 3 words. And they will take everything and they will put it away and you won't hear a single word while they do it. And then they'll go to their classroom. And we're like, get out of here. And he stood up and he yelled 3 words. And it was instantaneously silent. They put everything away and they just went to their class. And I said, what spell did you cast? I was just really curious. But it's an established culture. What are you going to do in the planning and policy as well? What are you going to do when a kid won't talk? When they're defiant and they're going to speak English in your school? So what they used to do, I don't know what they do now. I have to ask them. Well, I think I know what they do now. What they do now is every kid gets play money. And when they speak English, they have to give some of their money out. So they get kind of a fine. But it doesn't come out of their pocket. It's this allowance. Then at the end, there's a little store where they could buy little candies and toys and stuff like that. And that's what I saw with the little kids. When they used to do it with some of the older kids a long time ago, they'd say, you want to speak English here? Okay. And they'd give them an article in the National Geographic. And they say, sit down and copy that whole article word for word. And that was sort of, and then I said, now you get to go and spend some time with English. So like, how are you going to stop them from speaking English if that's the goal? And that's not always the goal from day one. If it's a beginning language class and you have adults, that's different than this, which is they're raised in Hawaiian. They already speak it by then. But some of the things in your planning and your policy is something that's always ongoing. The planning is sort of the brainstorming of what you're going to do, and the policy is the documents that you create that establish how you're going to do things. So you're going to have a statement of goals, methods, activities and roles, integration of elders, analysis of faculty. How are you going to determine if your faculty are doing a good job? Analysis of students. How are you going to grade your students? How are you going to take care of that? Discipline. What are you going to do with this stuff? Or even beyond it, some kids won't listen, other stuff like that. I saw this thing somebody posted. It was like, it said, Rage Against the Machine, my 4-year-old. And then there was a handshake in between them. And then there's a line from a Rage Against the Machine song, which was, F you, I won't do what you told me, right? So it's kind of funny. Like, so how are you going to get your kids to listen? How are you going to get and these are your students, and this is your values in action. Facilities. What do you have? What do you need? How are you going to get it? That's a huge part of it. They didn't start with a big, huge language school in Hawaii. They're in an old office. And then they just kept building it out from there. And then the health of the language. Like, you are going to be the caretakers of entire languages. And, it's tough stuff. I think the pressure and the pain is a big reason why there's not more of us here. We're small groups right now. But then when we transform it, other folks will be coming. The curriculum, so this is a big part of what we're talking about here as well. So within the curriculum, you can have a course, have a syllabus, and the syllabus talks about the learning ecosystem, like the safe spaces, the humor, the different things like that. The texts, the assignments, the assessment, and the sequence, what order you're going to do things in. And then every lesson has lesson materials and then some sort of lesson plan. And then also think of your community, right? You're going to need administrators. If you had a school, who would be the principal? You're going to need faculty. You're going to need students. You need families, communities. Within there as well as, for a lot of they have a lot of parent volunteers in a lot of their programs. And then that takes care of the need to sort of clean the facilities and stuff. But anyways, just sort of the big picture stuff I want us to continue to think about, talk about, so we're prepared to do kind of our final things in this course. So in addition to your weekly language lesson presentations, where you're not teaching us, but you're showing us the materials you're developing and the methods you're using to teach it. But we're also looking at these larger documents, which is, you have to define the program. You have to do that. And it's tough stuff because sometimes I think, who am I? Who am I to say how things should be? But then at some point, there's ways to reach consensus and to come up with some of that stuff. And we'll look at a few things before we go. Any thoughts?
I was thinking about that, what you're saying, like, who am I or who are we to make anything? But really, if we don't make it, nobody make it. Nobody's making it already. Nobody's, over the past how many years Tlingit language has been taught, it's been like little increments and not as developed as it could have been. And I heard there was an immersion school in like the 90s, maybe, or something. I can't remember where it was at, but it didn't last long, from what I heard.
They started a language nest through Tlingit and Haida, and it didn't really take off. The first one they tried in Hawaii as well didn't succeed. So even if you go there and you see this network of 13 language nests, and then many others outside of that network, and then a language school, and you can't even count how many speakers of Hawaiian there are. There's too many. But it wasn't always that. And so, yeah, there was that. There was also a proposal for a Tlingit language charter school a long time ago, which that proposal was never considered from what I heard. And so in terms of, yeah, like that's some of the sort of logistical things, like what is the thing going to be? And I'm not asking you to solve that, but as you go forward and do your language work, these are the things. So you basically have, how are you going to teach your adults? How are you going to create places where people use the language? How are you going to make sure that families are using it? How are you going to teach the kids? Right? And so it's a big picture thing. And always look out for these either or arguments that I think the colonial world would like to present you with. Like when we first started talking about a Tlingit language charter school, and trying to kick that discussion back up again, I think some people started saying, well, we're gonna have either that or the current TCLL program, because we can't have both. And I was like, well, who said, where does that come from? Who's saying that? And so when they try to sort of reduce it down to these things where it's like, well, you could do that or that, and just go for the yes and conversation to say, because they don't do that with other things. Like they don't say, well, you could have this math and science club, or you can have a math class. You got to take your pick. Like they'll let them have both. So. Any other thoughts, folks? So a lot of, oh, go ahead.
I was teaching the Juno Shamalia class this weekend, and I was just using the curriculum that I was taught. But my dad was on there. My dad, Doug Modig, was on there, and I said I want to acknowledge my dad. And he said that he was too embarrassed to speak. So, and I know that he grew up with all the people that created the Alaskan dictionary and everything. And he was like, I'm just embarrassed to speak. So I didn't know where that came from, but as his daughter, I'm going to create him a PowerPoint with greetings where he could just listen to it and read it over. So hopefully that will help. But yeah, I didn't realize that that you could just be embarrassed, because I make an ass of myself all the time in the language.
Yeah, that when we go up in generations as well, some of that fear is like when we document, like, so there's this concept called willingness to communicate, and there's whole theories in there if you want to sort of take a deep dive. But some of it's talking about like building up these foundations that just increase the likelihood that people will speak, because it's very interesting. I have to think most Tsimshian peoples, most Haida peoples, most Tlingit peoples, most Dankhanag peoples, they have to know that the language is really in trouble, like really, really, like 1 or 2 generations away from just being gone. And yet there's a tremendous reluctance to speak it, right? And this also, once people are there and it's a recorded or broadcast or some form of public thing, that tends to sort of ramp everything up. And I think going back to what Liana was saying, like I've talked to people who said, I know the language, I know it. But when I try to talk, like I can feel my throat literally closing. And so these are things that we also have to sort of come to grips with, and this is up at the philosophy of the program, right? The philosophy of the program. I used to think, well, we're kind of having a conversation in Hawaii, and I said, this is kind of what I feel like with our language right now. I feel like It's a scene in the movie Titanic where the ship broke and it sunk and everybody's in the water and people are like screaming. It's very scary and dark, cold. And I feel like there's a boat that's going around and somebody's yelling through a bullhorn, "Why didn't you learn how to swim?" And I thought, well, how do we get it so that it's just this really cool, fun boat with big blankets and nice music and tea and coffee, and that's where everybody wants to be. And so, like, trying to always, there's part of your work is going to be to work in teams and to figure out how to deal with some of the psychological aspects of language loss. And part of that is the fear and the nervousness, and the part of it is one of the things that colonization did that I think doesn't get enough attention is it convinced us to not believe in ourselves. And this is something that there's a scholar named Moana Jackson. He's a Maori scholar. I'll put a link to a video of his that I recommend you all watch. I'll put it on the Blackboard page for our class. But that's exactly what he said. He said it convinced us to not believe in ourselves, and it convinced us to not be free. And so one of those things is like this underlying feeling that we're doing something wrong, and also that we're putting our children in a place where they're not going to succeed. And sometimes we'll hear people say this directly. They'll say, well, a language school sounds great, but how are you going to get them ready for the real world or the modern world, right? And so that's an instant way of saying, like, we're doing a disservice to the children. We're doing a disservice to the people. And this is rooted completely in concepts of white supremacy that we also have to bring to the surface in certain conversations. But other conversations are going to have to be about safety and healing. And with the language, the community language class is a different situation, because you got people drifting in and drifting out. And sometimes you have like a university language class, which is everybody's here and we go structured up like this, or you have an adult immersion program where everybody's here and this is the plan. And so sometimes you have to give people a few sessions before you hand them the microphone, right? Or, and these are some tone setting things that are really important for language classes. And a lot of times I'll say, you could talk if you want to, but nobody has to. But there's different programs that handle this in different ways. Like I asked the Hawaiians, I asked this one guy, I was like, how'd you learn how to swim? He says, well, my dad took me on a boat, threw me in the ocean. So get back to the boat, and so, but that's not the case. It's not going to work for every kid. What if that kid just sink, and so these are some things to consider, and there's no easy answer. I'll share a couple of things that folks have said to. I know we said we're going to look at this mural thing, but we'll get a chance to. I was in a community and I was teaching language class, and then this guy, he said, hey, you're here to teach that language class, right? I said, yeah, you should come. He says, I don't know. He says, that man's always there getting ready to hit me for speaking my language. Ever since I was a little boy, he just hit me right upside my head. And then not long after that, someone else I was talking to, maybe a month later, they said, all our elders back in Canada, they're all deaf in their left ear. I was like, oh, really? And they said, shooting or what? They said, no, the teachers were right-handed, and when they'd speak their language, the teachers would cup their hand and smack them right in the ear. And after doing that for so long, it just really damaged their ears. So I think about the physical abuse, I think about the emotional abuse, I think about all the various spiritual abuse, sexual abuse that colonization brought to our peoples. And then one of our jobs is to figure out how to overcome that. And it's not easy. I think the program, it's whatever the program is you're building, it needs this whole series of things to talk about: group care, self-care, and how to sort of create these situations where people can emerge and overcome. But it's not easy, because I've been in the rooms where we were supposed to have a healing session, and I got yelled at pretty bad for a couple hours, and it's okay because that's somebody's pain. And I can get myself to a point where I'll say, well, it's not mine, so I can let go of it, but also I don't want to be the lightning rod. As they say, the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. So I think the key is a series of conversations and figuring out how to construct a program that's ready to deal with that. Yeah, working together, right? And really having probably an inner working group, right? So there's a group that can communicate about some of this stuff. And it's tricky because another thing that some folks told me is they said, when we built this program, we knew who was in charge, but we wouldn't let people know that we knew who was in charge. A lot of times when people ask us, we're like, we don't even know how this thing works. But that was because they didn't want any single person to come and take it over. Yeah, and so it's an interesting thing to always have these conversations. And I think I got an activity for you folks over the next week as we sort of shift our reading to sort of looking at, I think we're looking at Ojibwe and Maori, and let me check the other language group. Sami. So Sami is our third language. And so this is from there's quite a few texts out there that are kind of, you have an editor and they'll go collect some articles written by people in various language movements. So we're gonna take a look at start looking at some of these other language programs and what they're doing. And while we're doing that, I put a link, I emailed a link out. Did everybody get that today? I'm gonna check our email system and see if it works.
Oh,
Is that for the interactive?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's this program called Miro. And I'll show you what this thing kind of looks like. So Miro is a planning tool. So when you're sort of thinking about kind of a brainstorm, let me zoom in here. So here's the idea. So if you think of something, put it up here in a sticky note, right? So what you do is you'll click here to this little thing and you pick a color. I'll go with yellow. And then you put it here and then you could type. So define the problem. So I might say not enough speakers, right? So there's a problem. And now there's one here that says reverse the problem. So I'm going to say make more speakers, right? So start thinking of things like this. And it's just a brainstorm. And then what we're going to do is take the week. If it's not your sticky note, don't touch it. I don't think you can edit. I don't think I gave you, I don't know how it all works. I don't know if you can but just add stuff to it now. We're not taking anything off. If you make some sort of mistake and you can't fix it, let me know and I could probably go in and delete it so you could start over. But we're in this process of additive. So one of the things I'll share when it comes to planning is I think you should have a clear separation between your creative phase and your editing phase. What that means is you're not trying to critique anything, you're not trying to rank anything, you're not deleting anything. The world is wide open. If you think of an idea, you put it up there. If you don't agree with that idea, that's not your business right now because it's a collaborative environment and it's a brainstorm. There's an awful lot of human innovations that have taken place because people didn't worry about what they could or couldn't do, but instead try to envision what they should do, right? So we dream the impossible dream. So the other thing here is we're just trying to list what do you have, right? So we have maybe some birth speakers. And then, maybe we have something else. Then what do you need? Well, we need a school. And so there's these sort of boards. And then if If they're starting to get crowded, I can make them a little bit bigger. So don't worry about that. I'll keep an eye on it. I'll just check it every day and see how it's going. Your name's not put onto any of those things, so no one can track it back to you. It's a free, open brainstorm. What are some of the core cultural values of your program? So the core values are the things that you come back to. So no matter who it is, even if it's an elder visiting your classroom, you have some things to fall back upon. And I think that's really important, and that those become the operating principles of your program. And then here's the plan for program development. So this is sort of like, how are we going to get there? What kinds of things do we need to start doing, right? And feel like, if you have any questions, let me know. But don't feel like you're putting the wrong thing on there. Just put it on there. Don't hold back. Put a whole bunch of sticky notes on here. Then we have here, what are the changes that we're looking for? And the micro is individual, I'll put this on there, individuals and families. The meso is communities and regions, and organizations and institutions. Then the macro is the state, federal, and tribal governments. What kind of changes are we looking to make in the next 5 years, 5 to 10 years, and beyond 10 years? So this is what we're going to do. We'll just do a little bit of a brainstorm over the next week. So we have presentations on Wednesday. So we'll do that again. So keep an eye. Everybody know who's presenting? Everybody need to know?
Are we gonna do like a present it again, like come back to what we already did and see like how much we changed or advanced it?
Well, I think we'll, that's a good question. We'll probably cycle through everybody, and then we'll see kind of what folks want to do. Because this week we have Victoria, Sanjat, and Duck Juice, and then we'll have a little bit of time. So I think we could sort of revisit that stuff. We could also workshop some stuff. Individual sort of lesson presentations get us through the end of February, and then in theory, everybody has gone. So let me do this as well. So this is the schedule that I have. So if you don't see your name on there, you should make sure that your name is on there. Because once everybody goes once, and we have basically March and April, and then we'll decide, how do we want to use that workshop time? Do we want to work in groups and collaborate and then maybe refine one of these ideas? Do we want to work in pairs, or, we got options. And so as we sort of get towards here, we'll also take some time on the Monday class to start talking about what do we want to do for the next phase of presentations. Okay, anything else? Duck Juice, can you hear? Okay, shucks. Everybody else here okay? Okay, there might be some connection issues. The class is recorded, so I'll post the class onto YouTube. If you miss any classes, I don't know if I shared this with you folks. But this is the link. So here it is, youtube.com, UASANLS. Under playlists, there is, oh, where'd it go? Indigenous language methods and materials. So this is where I put the classes in case you needed to rewatch it, or in case you missed it and need to watch it, just so you folks know it's there. Okay, that's it, folks. Good conversation. Oh yeah. Okay. See you, folks.
Hasta lang song.
Yeah, again.
Goodness, cheese.
Goodness cheese.
Before you go, I think I may have found that phrase I was talking about, but the whole thing is in Tlingit, so I wanted to bounce it off you.
Oh, great.
Quotation marks, so it
Nope.
makes me doubtful, but Siske Sikanjik Sutat. And that again is what makes me think. But
What's the line number, do you know?
it's not lined, it's page like this here.
Okay.
And I'm a little bit frustrated because I must have went home with somebody else's book.
Uh-huh.
Because I have mine all noted out when he would translate stuff, and I would try and really keep up. And this one, it's somebody else's, so I have their notes and they have my notes. So
That same story is in Hashuka.
okay, is it all translated there?
Yeah, by Tom Peters.
Okay, yeah, I have that here. I'll take a look for it.
Okay.
Yeah, because it was a really good phrase, and it was right before. This is where the notes are, and it says that they were making the branches out of making a bed out of hemlock branches. So right around there seemed like a good spot to getting to where they were going. But
Wow. Well, I'll look for it, and we'll talk about it tomorrow in class.
yeah, sounds good. Thanks for taking a few moments.
Yeah, no problem. Sheesh.